Greetings to everybody that is tuned in for this week's Teacher Talk. It's such an honor to be able to connect with everyone that will be watching today, and for those of you that might be watching this when it's archived on YouTube. I am so excited to have a new colleague with us this week to be talking about the success that comes from possibilities and seeing possibilities as success as we're all navigating these unique times. And Nathan, I am fascinated with your last name, and I want you to pronounce it for me because otherwise I think I'll butcher it because of this unique O with the slash. So how do I pronounce your last name?
It's the O is for all the Norwegians who are leaving Trondheim and they couldn't figure out who pronounced the O which way. And so in the Trondsk dialect, they added the slash so that you know it was an O and not an U. So it's just a regular old O, but it has the slash. But it's pronounced Rodal, like I got in my car and rode all the way home.
Nice.
But
Rodal.
Ro, not on doll.
And I'm so glad you explained that. I have a ton of Norwegian heritage through my grandfather, and I didn't realize that. So that's to designate it as an O, so just Rodal.
And in Swedish, they use the umlaut.
Yeah. That's genius.
In Danish, it goes back and forth with all the Hanseatic history they have.
And it's good to know in the Pacific Northwest because we have lots of Scandinavians up here.
Oh, no shortage.
Well, so it is a pleasure to welcome Nathan Rodal, and I probably should have figured that out before we went live, but I'm glad that we have all been educated in some Norwegian letters and pronunciation. So it's fantastic to have you with us. I'm going to have you introduce yourself in just a little bit for people that might be tuning in outside of Washington or might not know where you're currently serving. I had the privilege of connecting with Nathan originally through the Washington Music Educators Association, and I am so excited to be working on him through some state initiatives through WMEA and learning more about his program and what he's doing in the state. But I think it's great to connect with colleagues that can sort of commiserate and share in solidarity the challenges that we're all facing, and something that has come up not only through what WMEA is promoting in the state, but also people that have been talking about all over the world that are involved in art education is just seeking new possibilities of making art and connecting with people. And today I wanted to start the conversation in this place where we look at possibilities as an avenue for success, that just trying something is showing the success that you're having because you're staying connected, you're making art, you're making music in our case. So I wanted to explore that, but then of course, like we do in all of our teacher talks, allow the conversation to mature wherever it needs to with important topics and things that we need to be considering. For those that might be watching for the first time, Teacher Talk started as just a way for me to stay connected to my own students. I'm Christopher Hanson. I serve as the Director of Music Education and Orchestral Activities at Seattle Pacific University. Teacher Talks are sponsored by a student organization that I have the opportunity to work with called Feathers. That's Future Educators in the Arts Transforming Human Experience and Realities. When we shut down last March and transitioned to fully online learning, I wanted to stay connected with my music education majors in particular. And so we created this sort of weekly podcast. We are now on our 23rd episode. And so it has gone on longer than I thought it would, but it's created some incredible opportunities to connect with musicians and educators, people that are in administrative roles, in nonprofit organizations and public schools all over the world, and helped me personally gain some really important perspective on how everybody is navigating this global pandemic, the social justice issues that have come to the fore recently, particularly in America. And so this has just been a really amazing platform. I feel so blessed to utilize technology to connect with people and discuss these things. I want to make sure, especially those that are watching for the first time, that Teacher Talks are not necessarily about providing answers or solutions to, definitive problems, but kind of the opposite. It's about sharing ideas and solutions to unique problems that some of us are facing, or answers to unique questions that some of us have posed. And through that, I hope that we can mature and nurture a dialogue amongst colleagues that will benefit you or others So I don't want anyone to assume that things that are suggested or talked about here are necessarily going to work everywhere. Again, it's not about finding the silver bullet to our problems, but it is about discussing some of the challenges that we're facing. And through that dialogue, I think we can find these possibilities that mature into the success that we're having in different areas. I also think it's great to just connect with colleagues and celebrate some of the things that they're doing. Everyone has become wildly innovative and are doing such extraordinary things. They may or may not work for you, but I think it's always good to reach out to people and say, hey, I see what you're doing and I think it's amazing and I respect it and honor it as an opportunity to stay connected and continue to make music with our students and with our colleagues. So Nathan, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're currently working, some of the things you're plugged into.
Well, I'm currently the high school orchestra teacher here in Port Angeles. Port Angeles, if those of you aren't aware, is sort of an aberration in small town music. It's a small town of about, I want to say, 8 to 10,000, something like that. Could be a little bit bigger. The school has about 800-ish kids this year, and there's 200 orchestra students. Yeah. And including when you include the numbers from the elementary and middle school students, we have about 1,000 students in the school district. Which
That's fantastic.
The last year was my first year in the district, and my immediate predecessor, James Ray, has been on the show a couple of times to talk to you now. And he started a lot of the kids that I teach now.
I never made that connection. That is awesome.
So when we're talking about, making connections with other educators, and I mean, James is like number one on the list of 3 people that I call for help when I have I've never experienced this, never encountered this situation. But now we find ourselves in no one has encountered this situation. A colleague of mine, a good buddy that teaches out at Central Valley in Spokane, Mason Flemmer, he says it's like my second year of first year teaching right now. and I think that's how it feels for all of us. And when we're, I'm just going to go ahead and go off on a tangent that,
yeah, please.
I'm Nathan. I teach at Port Angeles High School. That's about as much as we need to go into right now. But I see a lot of it's well-intentioned information and resources and webinars coming out of academia. But a lot of these people haven't taught real students in a real public school setting in over a decade. And if they have, it's like a private school thing, and really the orchestra is kind of their own show and they can do whatever they want to do. And this is not a time where we can beg forgiveness and just do whatever it is we want to do. We really have to stay inside the lines and follow the rules. And so every time I go to one of these webinars and this, the doctor of whatever has this great idea that could be applied really well in an academic situation, or even when we someday get back to normal, that would be really, really helpful. Mm-hmm. But depending on what your school district has decided about the way you engage with students, the information in these webinars is totally mute and unnecessary. And the one thing that I really need help with, I think we all need help with, and is the one thing that for sure, no matter what your school district situation is, that we need to focus on, is how to make contact with a student, whatever your restrictions may be, and help them to continue to identify as an orchestra student. Yeah. How do we do that? Because rehearsal, I don't know what that's going to look like. I have no good answers right now. I have asked permission to get, can I have 4 kids in the auditorium with me out in the audience? Because technically the audience is a separate room. So that's still 1 under the maximum if you wanted to add a bass player. Mm-hmm. And we could rehearse. Maybe I have 5 groups that meet a week, and maybe everybody out of all of my kids gets to meet once a month. Yeah. Which is not ideal, but it's better than nothing. That's the best idea I've got right now with the restrictions on top of me. And we talk a lot about the silver lining of the situation is that we can focus on the deep work the individual technique of each student. This might be your first opportunity to dive into 3-octave scales. You and I had talked earlier about putting together a list of teachers and professionals who'd be willing to do like either one-on-one or group lessons with students, because I'm a violinist and I can certainly use a cello in a passable way, but I'm not a professional cellist. And
yeah,
when it comes to, there's a situation where maybe this would be more comfortable in a different position, or, things like where you're doing a pivot rather than a shift that, as a non-cellist, I'm not the authority on that. So having somebody come in who is an authority on that instrument could be really helpful beyond just me meeting with my students. But that comes back to what is the straitjacket that your school district has put you in, for the best of reasons. I mean, they have all these risk management people
exactly.
who are telling them what they're able to do, and then you have county officials from your local government telling you what you're allowed to do. So this is no one person's fault. I don't want to appear negative towards any administrator or administration or school district. That's we're just playing the hand we're dealt. But in the worst case scenario, or not worst case scenario, but if I can't get those teachers to come in, if that's not approved, then it'll be me and meeting one-on-one with those kids. But what I worry about is in class, when we do the technique stuff, when you pull out the Chris Selby, habits of a successful orchestra musician, the kids don't super enjoy doing that work.
It's tedious. Yeah.
Class. And so if that's the only kind of work that we're planning on doing, how are we going to keep these kids excited? I have long held a philosophy, and it's not something that I learned in the world of education. It's something that I learned playing in community orchestras, because teachers, we need clock hours to keep our certification. And a great way to do that, if you're a music teacher, is to be part of a community group, either a community choir or a community orchestra or a community band. And I've played under a lot of different directors with a lot of different philosophies. And at the end of the day, I think you need to accept that there's only so many people who are actually going to practice at home. I mean, in this, with adults, there's only so many people who are actually going to really seriously pull out the music, turn on the metronome, and practice. Because none of us are being paid to be at one of those community orchestra situations. I mean, every now and again, there's a principal player who is. That's sort of a one-off situation. But what's at the core, what's the reason those people have come together to make music? And the only answer I can come up with is that they love to make music together. And so when you're in a rehearsal with a director who's like picking apart like the evenness of a triplet in the clarinet, one clarinet player, not only does that one player now feel really like isolated and called out, but you have maybe 100 people sitting there doing nothing, that aren't getting paid, that have taken time, some of them driving quite a long distance to play with this orchestra, who aren't doing anything. And so in the classroom, it's my philosophy that we unpack and we play the whole time. Everybody plays. And when there's a cello thing it's in tenor clef and it's uncomfortable and it's awkward, and traditionally we would just deal with the cello section and let's get that fingering down. I'll do the work outside of class to transpose that part so that everybody can look at it. And then we all solve it together. And I think we're going to have to find a way to solve those problems together without getting too tedious. Because as soon as we just go 100% into music theory and 3-octave scales, I think we're going to lose a majority of those students who are there because that's the one class that they've had with their best friend since 4th grade. Because we're all in different math classes now, or we had to take different periods of the same English class. And that human connection is what kept them invested in orchestra. And I don't see a ton of great answers right now for how to keep the students not just engaged, but self-identifying as an orchestra student and drawing security in themselves from that identity in the formats that we're proposing. And I want you've talked to more people about this than I have. I wonder what is bopping around in your brain when I'm talking about this.
You're hitting on so many amazing things, and I'm glad you're bringing them up because I want to tread lightly because I never want someone to assume that my experiences or observations and the things that I share are meant to be sort of condemnation of their own work or judgment towards the things that they're trying. But all of that being said, I use that preface as a way of saying I do see issues with the system in which we educate educators and we prepare music educators, and it is frustrating to say the least. I want to work backwards from what you were talking about. So first and foremost, something that I do appreciate, whether we want to phrase it as seeing a silver lining, but something that I think is work that needs to be done, is revisiting our philosophy of teaching music in public schools. And why are we doing it? And if, I was actually just talking to my partner about this yesterday, that I've talked to a few colleagues that have appropriately been frustrated because the way in which they were taught to teach, the way in which they have led their programs was completely based on performance and festivals and competition and concerts. And so now that that's been taken away, they really don't know what to do. And they have lamented either through social media or through, private conversations of like, well, I just don't know what to do. And I've tried to be careful because I'm having similar struggles in my own right. I'm still an orchestra conductor at the collegiate level at a small liberal arts school. So it's very attuned to the skill set of a high school orchestra. I'm working with a lot of non-music majors. So I'm programming a lot of the same music and dealing with that same sort of, the students in high school are not necessarily seeking a degree in music or seeking further advancement in music after high school. So you're getting people with varied interests, with varied levels of ability and investment in your ensemble to make music together. So I really do liken a lot of what I'm doing at SPU to still working with sort of an advanced high school ensemble. It's that same level of engagement. And that's not pejorative. That's not a judgment, right? That's an observation.
I'm so glad you said this because I've had this conversation with multiple people, and I'm not afraid to say it, that there are a lot of conductors out there of bands and orchestras and choirs who are so obsessed with the competitive aspect of music. And in the annals of history, when it's all over and you're nothing but bones and dust, nobody is going to care that you were the best junior high band director. It doesn't matter, like the impact on. But if you were a really compassionate educator that really focused on making a connection with each child in whatever way that opening was for them, I mean, you're going to get the kids who do want to go on and have some kind of career in music, and just their own ambition of being that kind of person, they're going to get that whether it's from you or not. But the 80 or 90% of the rest of the kids who are there just because their friend is, or because they liked orchestra in fourth grade and now they've been doing orchestra since fourth grade. And it's our job to kind of nurture that relationship. And orchestra or music is just the medium. But the really powerful opportunity we have is to train young minds to be good people. That's what we're really teaching. Music is kind of the side gig here. I mean, the music is the medium through which we train young minds.
I think the real challenge is, and this is what I get at, you have to contextualize the ensembles that you're working with, or to translate that into broader terms, you have to understand your classroom. Who are the students that you're serving? And I say that because I do believe that teachers are public servants. And I think we need to be more connected to our community. So I'm bringing all of this up to get to one of the original points that you made, that when we're looking at the music teacher preparation programs, when we're looking at the education that we give future educators, there really is a disconnect. I don't get frustrated with educators that I meet that are completely focused on competition and performance and travel, because that didn't come out of thin air. You came from an education that taught you that these were the things that were important, significant, whether that was an education that you received at a university, or it was an education you received through your student teaching experience or internship, or it was something that you experienced, the education you received when you were in secondary school and plugged into your music ensemble. At some point in your life, someone taught you that this is what makes success in a music classroom. These are the things. And we so quickly detach ourselves in general from my observations, we detach ourselves from being educators of human beings, and we start to build this ivory tower on our campus of, well, I'm the band director, the choir director, the orchestra director, the theater instructor, the dance instructor. I've challenged a lot of colleagues with this. You know, when someone asks you, what do you do? Is your response, well, I'm the orchestra director? Are you immediately segregating yourself by subject, or do you say, well, I'm a public school teacher? Can you wear that badge with pride? And I'll steal a quote from Bob Phillips, who's, you know, an incredible pedagogue,
You
string
teach the
pedagogue.
child in front of you? Is that the quote?
Teach the child in front of you. And I've stolen that from him and modified it to an extent to say, teach the human being in front of you.
Yes.
And you know, Bob always pushes. He created that sort of catchphrase to say, you're not teaching the students that you want in 5 years as you're building your program. You're not teaching those incredible students you had 2 years ago that you lament graduated. You're teaching the people right where they are in front of you. And you know, Henry Wong and all of these great educational philosophers and pedagogues have told us it's about meeting students where they are. It's about starting where your students are. And everything that we see in sort of popular educational professional development and the new pedagogy that's being promoted is talking about growth. It's about tracking growth and trying to appreciate this is where we started and this is where we end up. And that affects how you do assessment, that affects how you do instruction, that affects your classroom management. So if we peel back the layers, and again, one of your original points of a lot of the university professors that we look at that are teaching future teachers haven't been in the high school or middle school or elementary school classroom in over a decade, and those classrooms are wildly different.
Yes.
The higher ed in general is completely consumed with pedagogy. And I think that's part of the problem, if we're identifying it as a problem, because again, I don't want what I'm saying to sound condemning.
It's contextually relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, these textbooks we're referring to, and we could list names and we could list other books, but the teaching that pedagogy to aspiring teachers is important from the context of this, like how scope and sequence works, and how you should structure a unit of study. And, you know, don't just show up and rehearse, you know, actually have a plan. What are your goals? And how are you going to achieve them? And how are you going to measure them? These are important things. But it's sort of like getting ready for the Olympics or something, and you get out on the diving board, and all of the advice that everybody's been giving you, you can't remember. Like, that's what it's like to be in the classroom for the first time without your mentor teacher there. Is, you know, all of these books that I read like, they don't matter anymore, because I've got a kid who's screaming at me about, I don't know, and I've got two girls over here fighting, and I've got this other group of kids that just kind of want to play some music, and I've got to find a way to put out all these fires at the same time, and then maybe get to some music, which is what I was taught to do in college. And to some extent, I was taught to, you know, de-escalate situations and know what to expect from, you know, intense behaviors from students. But I openly say that my junior and senior year of college have been just as effectively served full-time student teaching. I would have learned much more that way.
Well, yeah, and I think the biggest issue is, and this is how academia works in just sort of Western culture, is that we want to specialize. We want to segregate ourselves into disciplines, and therein lies the problem. I tell all of my music ed majors, who can attest to this, for those of them that are watching, I tell every freshman that comes in, you have to know that you are a double major. You are a music major and you are an education major.
Mhm.
You are seeking two different degrees and different disciplines that we have to marry. And I think
Mhm.
that becomes the problem, is that being a music major, you learn music history, you learn music theory, you start to learn, depending on your discipline, and usually music
Mhm.
ed, you learn pedagogy. And that's where we get misunderstandings from my perspective more often than not, is that what we teach music education majors is music pedagogy, how to teach music. And
Mhm.
some of those things are arguably universal.
Mhm.
If you're going to do rote versus note, right? Like there's room for debate, but you can talk about that. In string pedagogy, are you going to start your curriculum pizzicato, or are you immediately going to start with the bow? Are you going to
Well,
utilize the
and
fourth
this goes
finger
back
right away or
to the
not?
Bob Phillips thing of you teach the student in front of you. I'm involved in the uh, National Association for Music Educators. There's an orchestra council,
Mhm.
and Beth Fortune, who teaches in Ballard, invited me to be on this council. And one of our other members, her name is Sarah Goulish. She teaches somewhere in Pennsylvania, I believe. And she is someone who was not a string player originally, and was brought into a strings situation in I believe a predominantly black community, and the Western model of preparing string music was not working for her. And so she developed this whole other thing where the kids are kind of composing their own music,
Yeah.
and the performance doesn't look like we sit in this arch situation with a conductor waving a baton, because you have to meet the student where they are and teach the person in front of you. And if the Western model of I stand on the podium, you sit in that chair, and we're going to go through Eine Kleine, and I'm going to teach you how to shift to third position because that's how my teacher taught me. And when we were doing this solo, that we play this measure on the D string because that's how my teacher did it, is examining whether or not that still serves us. It doesn't mean that, and I think we're both trying to say this, that the approach of academia is not invalid.
No.
There contextually it's very important, but there are times when we need to ask ourselves, is this still working?
Well, and see, I think there's a place where we diverge in that, because my issue is the compartmentalization of these
Mhm.
skills.
Mhm.
We, in general, at most universities, we have people student teaching for, one semester or one quarter or one year. We have this finite amount of time that you're out in the schools observing professionals, and it frustrates me in that we need to invest more time both in the literature and the curriculum of these music education courses of teaching people how to be educators that
Mhm.
happen to be teaching music. We
Mhm.
need to focus more on some of the things that you brought up, the classroom management strategy, how to build curriculum, how to do lesson planning. I felt, I felt in my own story, because I feel like I can speak to that in the truest sense. I was what is identified in the state of Texas as a non-traditional educator, in meaning I did not complete my student teaching or do my certification when I was in college. I got to my senior year as an undergrad and realized that teaching in public school was really difficult. I didn't want to do it. I was turned off by it because I was working in after-school programs and community music programs. And I was like, I don't know how public school teachers do it. I don't want that job. It's too hard. And I shied away from it. And I had been a music ed major for 4 years, and I decided to leave with a degree in composition. So then I went to grad school and was still working with community music programs and after school programs. And I went to grad school, got graduate degrees in music, and knew a lot about music pedagogy. I felt very confident, again, leading community music programs and teaching music in other avenues. You don't just teach music in public school, you can teach music in lots of different areas. But teaching in public school means that you are taking on the mantle and the identity of a public school educator, and
Mhm.
that has unique responsibilities. And I mourned for many years, especially my first 3 years of teaching in public school, that I really didn't understand how to be a public school teacher. I knew how to be a music teacher. I understood music pedagogy. I knew how
Mhm.
to address those concerns and problems and questions. But when it came to teaching human beings in a classroom environment in the 7 or 8 period day on block scheduling, like all of the things that go with teaching public school, I felt woefully unprepared. Even though I completed a certification process, even though I had the credentials, there was so little time talking about the practical and philosophical implications of you are a public school teacher in this state, in the United States, contextualizing it. What does that mean? And although I'm constantly sort of battling this idea of how significant philosophy needs to be a part of the music ed curriculum, I feel that we need to talk more philosophy because those are where we're making our decisions. And that's what actually guides us in the classroom of, is my philosophy of teaching music in public schools to expose people to, representing and expressing themselves and their realities of the world through music? Do I see music as this avenue to enlighten people and to broaden their perspective of the world? Or is my philosophy producing great performances? That is a philosophy of music education. It's not the only philosophy, however, and it becomes a disservice to you in moments like we're living through now, from my perspective, because then when you are confronted with, well, guess what? That opportunity doesn't exist anymore to create that product, to have that assessment. So what's left?
Well, and I'll back up my colleague James Ray, who has frequently told me that if you're focusing on the students and to some degree the individual needs of each student, which may be emotional, which may be technical, like this the cello player never learned how to learn tenor clef, and we've got to find a delicate way to address the one student in the room. But if you deal with all of these social emotional things and you make a good connection with students and you get the kids excited about music, the good performances will follow. That can be subsequent of focusing on the individual needs of each student. But if you put it the other way around, where the reaching this maximum performance is your goal, you're going to miss all of the social and emotional learning that could have taken place all the while.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the very first guest that we had on Teacher Talks was Dr. Birch Browning, who I love. He wrote a book, and I'm gonna try to find a link that I can put in here. It's an orientation to musical pedagogy, and there's a part of the book that I really appreciate. He talks about sort of this journey that you go through as an educator. And looking at educational statistics, that fifth year, what a lot of people call the hump, is a defining moment. A staggering majority of teachers do not survive their first 5 years of teaching. Most of them leave the profession before 5 years. 3 years is a milestone, 5 years is the big one. And when I had started teaching, I was really determined to get past my fifth year teaching in public school. And I remember, and I was so glad that Dr. Browning had articulated this. He talked about those first 3 years, and it's been a while since I read this, so I might misconstrue the layout of this, but I highly recommend that book. It's the book that we use for our Introduction to Music Ed class. He talks about in those first 3 years, really as an educator, you're teaching for yourself. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you are exercising all of these skills that you've tried to attain. And so many of the goals that you create are for yourself. I want to perform this piece. I want to try this book out. I want to get my students to this place. And it's really you trying to figure out, how am I most effective? And all of your decisions are really focused on yourself. There's a moment at which you transition and you start thinking about the classroom, which I found interesting. And so he says, then it becomes these larger goals that are less focused on yourself, more focused on your program and program development. And really, when you become this expert teacher, if you will, he doesn't use this language, but ultimately get to the point where you start to focus on your students. And you start to learn how to differentiate and how to serve every single person in your classroom with these goals. And I think that process, which really is a philosophical process, this process of inquiry, this critical reflection into our teaching, is where we fall short more often than not, because we get so consumed in what I would consider the minutia. We get so consumed in how can I teach you to shift a thumb position? How can we talk about alternate fingering or articulations into that day to day, the grind, if you will, of this is what we're sort of actively doing in the classroom, is teaching these unique skills to get to these end products. And we don't pull it back to say, and I'm going to use your example, we're trying to read tenor clef in our cello section. Okay, why are we trying to read tenor clef? Well, because it's in this piece that we programmed. Okay, well, why did you program that piece? Like, let's talk about that. But that's not the end of the conversation, because you might have a really valid reason, but I'm going to intentionally make it somewhat superficial. Well, because I saw this group perform it at conference and it was such a cool piece, and I want to be like that programmer, that director. Okay, great. Why do you want to be like that programmer director? Because they got to perform at a conference? Is that your end goal? No. I just think they performed the piece really well and I really like the piece. Okay, well, why do you like the piece? Because it was attractive in public? Is that what was attractive? Like, there should be more substance to it. Well, no, because I looked at the score of the conference and I saw that it would be really challenging, and that's why I wanted to do it. So are you just wanting to program music because it's challenging? Why is it challenging? Just because it's technically challenging? Shouldn't there be more to the music that you're programming, you're teaching to that? Like, is it just because, well, no, if you could scale it back within a critical conversation of your teaching and say, I have these pursuits of performing this piece that I've been able to contextualize in our curriculum with social relevance and cultural relevance, but I know that we're not going to achieve that piece until my cellos can play in tenor clef and my second violins can play in tune in third position and my first violins can play in fifth position. So what I'm going to do is scaffold. And in the fall, I'm going to program this piece, which is most challenging for the cellist, and I'm going to be able to focus on the cellist, and my other sections are going to be able to do this. And when you can articulate that, that to me is you're educating. You get it. You understand how to build curriculum. You understand how to scaffold. You understand how to create these academic goals, but you're able to tie them into these loftier social goals. You know how to work with each of your sections and build success for them. I feel like that is where, more often than not, and I'm lumping myself together with my colleagues that are music educators that prepare music teachers, I think that's where we fall short, is we don't connect the dots. We talk about music pedagogy and about program music and about building programs, and at some programs you talk about fundraising and recruiting and retention, and that's all great, but then we just sort of drop into the School of Education to talk about scaffolding and differentiation and serving every student, all this, and we create it as passe. And forgive me for my increase in volume and tempo in my speech. You can tell I'm getting a little heated because it really upsets me, because I don't feel, more often than not, and there are absolutely extraordinary exceptions, but from my experiences as an industry, as a music education industry in academia, I don't think we're preparing music teachers to be educators. I think we're preparing them to be music teachers, and it has to be more than that.
I have seen the students come out of every which school, and I think the universities here in Washington are some of the best around for especially music education in particular. Between Pacific Lutheran University, where I graduated, and Central Washington and Western, and certainly SPU as well, are doing a good job of churning out educators who want to go out into the world and make a real human connection with students as a primary goal. But back to your point about the first 5 years of teaching, is there are just things that you are only going to experience in the classroom. And if we were really having discussion about how do we challenge the way that academia handles training educators, I think we would need to talk about getting music ed students or education students in the classroom more, and finding, because it's almost like when we go into the classroom, our mentors are trying to hold our hands, but they're getting into an elevator.
Well, no, actually, I want to pause you there. One of the issues that I have is we've created an apprenticeship model for teachers. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the issue. I've shared this a couple times on Teacher Talk. One of the reasons that I made the leap from teaching high school to teaching college was I wanted to incite change in music education, and I realized it's going to happen where we're training our teachers. You know,
Mhm.
I recognized my own deficiencies as an educator, and I recognized the challenges in the system. We do teach in a system, a public school system. I recognized the deficiencies in the system, and I was tracing it back to my preparation in college. I was
Mhm.
taught to think this way about education. I was taught to view it this way and problem solve this way. So I wanted to be a part of the solution. And for me, the solution resides in how we are training teachers. And so
Yeah.
I made a very conscious decision to make that leap and to go into that area. And in doing so, I became hypercritical of what was going on. And I said, really, I want to hear from my students. I want to know what they think. And I reached out in my first year talking to alumni and talking to student teachers and talking to freshmen. And what do you want to see? What do you want to do? And every single one of them said, I want to teach more. And I recognized in building my courses in my first year that I was already perpetuating what it is that I wanted to change. All of my syllabi were this apprenticeship model where I was the expert. I have taught in public school. I know the answers, and I'm going to share my experiences, and you're going to take notes, and you're going to reflect on my experiences, and you don't get to teach until you go to student teaching. And I thought, wait a minute. And I immediately tried to flip that, and it was very eye opening to me. And forgive me because this is going to sound so judgmental towards my students, but it was truly awakening for me. I was teaching a woodwind methods course, and we were going through it, and we had read the book, and they were had their instruments, and I was teaching them, you know, here are some things that you can do. And me teaching a woodwind methods class is scary enough because I am a violinist and an orchestra director at heart. So I'm going through this class, and immediately I thought, why do I keep saying the same thing? Like, they need to do it. They need to be teaching each other. We need a peer instruction model. This is, you know, research shows that this works. So I told one of the students that I want you to get up here and you're going to lead this exercise, and I want you to offer feedback to the students. And they were mortified because they got up in front of everybody and they went, and they literally, the student looked at me and they said, I don't know what to do. And I realized, you know what? The reason you're in this position is because I have not done my job. I have given you the book that tells you how to teach, that tells you how to do the thing and how to problem solve, but it's words. It's useless until you put it into application. And I'm expecting you to retain this for 3 years and put it into practice your senior year when you're student teaching. And as you already pointed out, and you get in front of the students and you go blank because you've got all this information without any practical application. And so immediately, and whether we call it, which I think is kind of a cliche and not necessarily used correctly, the flipped classroom, if you will, because people don't really exercise that the way that it was designed. But if you really do say, especially in music teacher preparation programs, we're going to learn this information, and this is the model I've tried to adopt. We spend the first 3 or 4 weeks of a quarter getting that content knowledge. You know, here's the book that has the resources you need. Here's the lived experience. Here are my anecdotes and stories. Let's watch some videos and see what teachers are going through. But halfway through the quarter, I put my students in the front of the classroom. I have
Mhm.
told you how you can listen to a young clarinet player and where you can identify some issues, whether there's some leakage or there's not enough air or not enough support or they're fingering incorrectly. Or I've taught you all of that in terms of where to get that information, what it looks like. Now I need you to stand in front of these young clarinet players, hear that, and then execute how can I solve that problem and how can I teach that and approach it.
All of the big names in education, in academia, have identified thoroughly through research and double-blind studies that learning by doing is the
Yes.
most powerful way to learn. But then the way that we teach educators is just giving them a book and then telling them just verbally the way, and then maybe they write a reflection paper. And I'm just to speak to this, I've got to talk about my own experience a little bit, because there was a big turning point for me in my student teaching where the classroom was flipped on me, where I didn't get what I expected based on my experience in academia, which was well intentioned, and all of my professors at PLU, I think they did their very best to prepare me for the methods that they sought to apply. But I was student teaching with Paula Ferguson, who is the orchestra director at Redmond High School, and sort of sat down my first day, and the first class was about to start, and she said, "Okay, go for it." Oh, we have a visitor. So she didn't. She'd picked out the music already, and she just kind of said, "Well, go do your thing," and kind of sat there and watched. And there were a couple of days where it got kind of ugly, where I didn't really know what I would. The same way that a first year teacher would experience being out there on their own with no lifeline. And she was there. I could see she was there. If things really burned down and people were throwing things, I'm sure she would have helped me. It never got to that point, thankfully. But afterwards, we would have a little debrief, at the end of the day, and she would say, "Hey, in third period, something happened." And I was, "Yeah, what was that?" And she would say, "Well, what do you think?" And she would tell me zero answers.
Exactly.
Zero answers. But she would sit with me until I had sufficiently worked out what I had done or failed to do to move the ship in the right direction. And then the next day, I would have figured something out. And you like you're saying, you try things because as a new educator, your focus is on the repertoire or achieving some kind of technical achievement goal, not on.
See, and that's the issue because that's what you were, or I should say, I'm trying not to be condemning, like I said,
Yeah.
but it bothers me because that's what you were taught to focus on. I think that to me is the philosophical issue, is if you went through this program and you were trained to say, what is most important to me is to make sure that you land this, fingering in tune, we're looking too small. I mean, we're really focusing on something that's too narrow. And I want to stress for those that are interested, this was a turning point for me in grad school. I was very grateful. I had a professor that introduced me to a book. It's a dense read, but for anyone that's interested in doing it, I highly recommend it. It's called The Ignorant Schoolmaster by Jacques Rancière. I'll put a link up here in a second to it. And one of the, spoiler alert, one of the big things that he points out, he chronicles the work of an educator named Joseph Chapelle. Powerful question that an educator can ask, that man can ask, is, what do you think?
Yeah.
He says every educator should be asking this question. He said because the goal is, the whole point that he makes of saying the ignorant schoolmaster is that we perpetuate this very old European model of, the explicator in the front that explains everything and has all the answers, and you're not supposed to talk and understand anything until I give you the understanding. Paulo Freire talks about it as the banking model of education, where educators are just there to deposit information into students. There's all of these examples of this. But what's so liberating about Rancière's work is he says we have to start asking our students, what do you think? Because the point is that you're empowering them. You're giving them agency to create their realities. And it's not about, and this is something that I even changed for those that think, well, what does that have to do with, string pedagogy or music ed?
Everything.
I realized for years I just write, this is how you need to do it. And I never gave them time to say, well, let's try it in second position. And then, what do you think? I hated the string crossings. Great. Well, just tell us the fingering, Mr. Hanson. No, I want you to learn. That's the point. I don't want to dictate how you play this piece and when you play this piece. I want you to understand that the skills I'm giving you are there to explore. There isn't one way of fingering it. There's not one way of doing it. And I don't want to just supply those answers. So the fact that, you had that experience, I'm so grateful for, because to say, like, wow, third period was rough, wasn't it? Yeah. How do I make it better? Well, what do you think? Because you're going to be teaching the way that I teach, but you're not the same educator as I am.
I will say that was a frustrating way to learn, but I'm grateful that it happened. To take kind of what you were talking about and look at it from the meta perspective, is when we are born, we are all sent into somebody training. Is everybody in our world is trying to teach us how to be somebody. And then maybe someday when we grow up, some person will look at us and say, geez, you're really somebody. But that doesn't really help us anymore. I think the better question is, how do you serve? How do I serve? and ask that question of our students, especially if you're someone who is in charge of training educators, is asking them, how do you serve? What is the way that you serve your world around you? And this goes so much farther outside of music, is just in any interaction with a student, to bring it back to music, how was I serving this student in this interaction? When I was asking them to play in second position, how was I serving them? And just really investigate that, because there might be a situation where it didn't occur to them to play it in second position, and it would be beneficial to them to experience second position for the first time. So that would be, you're serving them well in that scenario. But if you were this competitive person who's just thinking about performance goals, and you ask yourself, how do I serve? Well, I think sort of a blanket answer is, you serve not everybody, is how you serve. You serve the couple of people who are willing to work hard, whether it's you or somebody else, as long as they're the taskmaster. That's how you serve, is not everybody. And whatever our individual philosophy is, or however we were trained, or however we're training future educators, we need to be able to say that we're going to serve the whole room.
Whoop. Sorry, I'm having to balance my mute button.
Oh, there you
go. And I love the fact that you're employing this verb, to serve, because again, I don't think it's also, I mean, I think this is worth bringing into the conversation at this point, and we hinted at it earlier. One of the reasons I wanted to contextualize my role as an orchestra director at SPU is, and I struggle with this, I'm putting myself out there, to be honest, this like mystique, of the ensemble director, or, oh my goodness, you're a university professor. I have struggled to make sure that in social engagement that I try to introduce to people, oh, what do you do? I'm a teacher. Mm-hmm. I don't, I am proud of the things I've accomplished, and I'm so blessed to be able to serve at a university and teach future educators. But I struggle with this sort of social mantle of like, well, I'm a university faculty member, and so that means something. No, I don't want to lose being a teacher, because that's really my job, is to still be a teacher. And wherever you're teaching, my mother actually had this sort of rude awakening when I got this job. And forgive me, I know that this is somewhat crass to talk about this publicly, but people that know me know that I really don't have any secrets. My mother was excited for me. She knew I was applying for these jobs, and she was so excited. My mother doesn't have any sort of background in education or anything like that, so just total novice to sort of the structures of education. And when I started teaching, I was teaching middle school orchestra, and then I turned that into a middle school high school position. I was teaching part-time at both, and then I was full-time at high school. So I had this sort of maturation, and my mother had always assumed that elementary school teachers teach elementary school for a certain amount of time, and then they get promoted to middle school, and then they get promoted to high school. And if you do the job right, you can get promoted into teaching at a university. And so when I was applying, she's like, oh, wow, like in her mind, I like met the qualifications because I had taught high school long enough. And so she goes, well, this must be really exciting for you, because this is, I think she even said, like, this is a big promotion. And aren't you excited about that? And I was like, well, no, I mean, I'm going to be teaching different things. I'm teaching different people. I'm teaching a different age group, and cognitively they operate differently. I'm teaching some different subjects, because I'm no longer teaching, orchestra. I'm teaching how to teach orchestra. Like, it's this inception thing of like, now I'm teaching how to teach the thing.
The how do I serve question? How do I best serve?
Well, it's interesting, because that misconception creates those social stigmas. And I said that this is somewhat crass, because one of the big conversations I had to have with my mother is, she was like, well, I'm so happy for you, and you're finally going to get paid what you're worth. And I had to explain to her, college faculty members don't make a lot of money. If you're tenured and you've been in an institution for a long time, you can get there. But, and I've told a lot of people this, and forgive me again, this isn't a judgment thing. This is about realities. I really try to push that to people. I took a teaching full-time as a high school orchestra director because I had stipends that came with my position. I was overseeing the vertical alignment, the fifth grade strings program, and the middle schools. I had a vast number of responsibilities, and I had built up in my years of service. We had a pay increase for every year that we served in our district. So I had built my salary up in the district that I was serving at. Then when I took a new position as a first year tenure track assistant professor, I started back at the bottom of the totem pole. I took a pay cut, and my family could not process it. They said, well, that doesn't make any sense. You're a college professor. Clearly, you make more money than a public school teacher. And I was like, no, I am a teacher. And in general, in America in particularly, we struggle culturally and socially to respect education in general. That's another teacher talk.
And to a further point, what our elementary strings teachers are doing is just as, if not more important than what's happening at the college level.
Please talk about it.
You're not going to have anybody who comes up to the middle school to play that comes up. It's only attrition from the beginning all the way up until we get people who want to be music educators. You know, when we in Port Angeles, when we start with, you know, a vast majority of all fourth graders do strings, that number isn't going to go up by the time they get to high school. You know, and we've got to find a way to retain as much as possible.
Yes.
But not focus on that in a way that I'm going to bend over backwards to keep every kid. Because there are people who, if we ask ourselves, how do I serve and how do I best serve and how do you best serve yourself and your community, is there are some people who are meant to be in band, and that's fine. And there are people who are meant to be in choir. And there are people like me who are meant to be in choir and orchestra. And there are people who are not meant to be in orchestra, and there are people who are not meant to be teachers. And this is a philosophy of mine, if you get to the end of high school and no one has asked you what you want to do with your life, we have all failed you. Because if you get to college and you're wasting, you know, $50,000 worth of, you know, debt or mommy and daddy's money, and you don't know what you want to do yet because nobody asked you that how do I serve question, you know, that hurts me. And so a big part of my education is through music and through performance and the unique way that a music class allows you to make a connection with a student in a way that just for whatever reason doesn't seem to happen in the math class. Ask kids that question just in those little passing moments that happen. And I work with my seating arrangements in such a way that I get an opportunity to talk with every student, you know, as frequently as possible, and just ask that question of, you know, what interests you, what gives you fulfillment, so that when they're asked that question of how do you want to serve your community after high school, maybe they have an answer. But I totally went off on a tangent there. But getting back to it is something that my predecessor James Ray said, is that you cannot see the high school position as more important than the middle school or the elementary
Absolutely.
school. You cannot look at it that way. Because as I pointed out, it's only attrition from that point up. And so it's, if you have dwindling numbers from freshman to senior year, you can't blame the elementary teachers for not sending you enough kids.
Yep.
You know, if you got a hole in the bucket, you deal with that and patch the hole and find a way to work it out. But college professors and high school music teachers, we really need to look at our feeders as equals, if not betters, because the work that they're doing in many ways is more challenging because they're dealing at high school. I only have the kids who want to be in orchestra.
Exactly.
But they have made a choice, they have committed, and they did that. They made that same choice in middle school and high school. They doubled down. The elementary people, they got kids who just showed up. Well, I don't know, thought it might be fun.
Or the parents want them to be there. Exactly.
And that's a whole different conversation, is the parent who forced the kid to be there, is how do you speak to their spirit and get them to feel empowered by music, even if they don't feel empowered by the instrument their parents forced them to learn.
Well, and I wanted to before we leave for today, I can't believe an hour's already passed. I
In an
wanted to
hour?
return to that. Yeah, can you believe it? It's amazing. Thank you to Joe Divig. A shout out to one of our colleagues up here in Washington. He had made a
He was my
comment
high school
about
teacher.
yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, so he made a comment about a conversation on programming, and I wanted to make this connection so people won't think that I'm just being petty and bringing up salaries. I bring it up only to talk to the idea of this commodification of education or of just things in general in culture and society, that the perceptions of importance are tied to this monetary value or the larger numbers. Teachers that have bigger programs are more successful, right? Teachers that are winning more contests or playing more music are somehow more successful. That educators that make more money, depending on the district or state that you're in or the level that you're teaching, that makes a difference. The size of the school and the institution. Well, if you're teaching at a university and you're working with more students up there, then you're more successful than the elementary school teacher. That commodification and that valuing, I think, is where we see the greatest issues, systemic issues, is that there is no, and I struggle with it because I feel, again, blessed to serve in the position that I do, and I do believe that I've earned it. I've worked hard to be able to teach at the college level, but at the same time, that doesn't separate me from my elementary school colleague. It doesn't mean that I know more or less. It has nothing to do with the value of us as educators. We teach in different places. And so when I engage with people, and it's this, again, this like weird perceived, like, oh, well, Professor Hanson, because you have that title, you must know this. Like, no, it doesn't mean anything other than the fact that I teach at this school. The same way that I've never understood this. This is such a cultural thing. And maybe it was just in Texas, but I've met people that do this. Like at the daycares or at the Bible school or even in a lot of the elementary schools, like I'm Mr. Chris. But then when you get to middle school, I'm Mr. Hanson. But if I'm in college, it's Professor Hanson. That there's these titles, that in elementary school, so many of the educators and staff members will go by like their first name. And these weird little things that we do to try to devalue whatever grade you're teaching or what level you're teaching at, when we pull back, and this is hopefully to go full circle in this conversation to where you started us, Nathan, of having the service mentality and teaching the people in front of you and humbling yourself to know this isn't about my goals. This is about how I can lead people with the skill set that I have as an educator to a better place than they were than when we started.
Well, and that I just want to put a bow on it. I went over the comments as I read Joe's little comment. Is especially with the younger educators with the repertoire, and I am definitely guilty of having made repertoire mistakes many times.
Same.
If you meet the student where they are and be realistic with where that is, they're going to be more successful. And this is something that I think I quoted James on once already, but not so eloquently, is that if you give the students an achievable goal, you can have high expectations. If the goal so if you give a student or a young educator in training a realistic goal of something that it's a slam dunk, it's gonna happen, then you can hold them to these high expectations that the people at the competitive level hold their students to. But you've got to set that achievable goal first. And when we're looking at ourselves and what this next school year is going to look like, I think we need to some degree apply that to ourselves and to our students of what can we reasonably achieve and do reasonably well, and what am I reasonably able to do and set up for my students curriculum-wise, and have a little bit of grace with myself of how much am I actually going to be able to achieve, and determine what I'm going to do, and then hold myself to the highest possible expectation once I've determined what I'm actually capable of doing.
And it's so powerful the way you've articulated it, where again, sort of folding back onto a previous point of that's where I believe we need to focus as educators is the sequencing and the scaffolding and the curriculum development. Because exactly as you said, and I'm so glad that James shares the same sentiment. He's been on Teacher Talk twice now. I love being able to connect with him. It's about, because most people I think would hear that and assume they're lowering their standards, and that's not it at all. You are creating a goal, because then you create the standards that allow you to go even further. And whether you call it, Stephen Covey calls it begin with the end in mind, or there's all of these great, kind of kitschy ways of looking at it. But if you're looking at this end result of here's what I want my students to accomplish for these intrinsic benefits, how can I reverse engineer it? How can I get back to the beginning to say, then we're going to need to start here and be flexible in how we develop this year. And to this is in no way to have the last word, but I want to reiterate, I think the title that I gave somewhat sporadically to this conversation to start us off was, seeing possibility as success. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly what you're describing in this year, is that you're going to try things. And the fact that you're trying something has already set you apart. You're not giving up. You're not saying it's not possible. You're going to make music this year, whatever that looks like for you. And it should look different on every campus and for every grade level. And we need to be, in general, I think we should all be encouraging each other more and be celebrating each other more. Not, oh, well, you didn't do a virtual ensemble. Well, then you weren't really successful. Oh, you didn't have your kids meet in person in some way. Well, then you weren't really successful. Oh, we need to stop creating standards out of it.
All 800 Port Angeles Orchestra students, they're welcome to do that.
Right? But we need to stop creating standards out of the experiments. And I want to say that again. We don't create standards out of experiments. It defies the definition of an experiment. We're trying things so that we can create new opportunities, and that is success. In this year, I think that is success.
And not everything we try is going to be a success.
Exactly.
As long as we are open with the reflection of why did this not work, like Paula Ferguson did with me, is why do you think that didn't work?
Yes.
And be vulnerable with the families we serve and the students we serve of, hey guys, it looks like those of you who engaged didn't like this very much. What can we do next time? What have we done so far that worked well for you? And an engagement may or may not reflect actual student fulfillment. And whatever measures you're using to assess students will reflect that to some degree. But allowing yourself to have a couple of failures this year so that you can reach the kids in the way that they need to be reached. So don't have, like you're saying, don't think that you have to do a virtual performance. It doesn't work out because the kids couldn't follow the metronome, and then feel like now we're not going to do anything the rest of the year. Is, okay, well, that didn't work. Why didn't it work? And what about the way that it didn't work might tell me what will work. So the kids can send me videos.
Exactly. Yeah.
Does work. Or maybe if they can't do videos, maybe they can send you audio. It would be really easy to give the kids little tiny assignments of, hey, play measure 12 through 18. Just like, a couple of measures, and send that to me. And if it's just short little snippets, no matter how many kids I have, I can actually give you some pretty directed, specific feedback that I wouldn't have had time for in the classroom.
And it's about, I think it's a paradigm shift. I think no one can argue that we're going through this paradigm shift together. But a part of it is getting rid of, the F word, failure. We need to stop seeing it as, well, I didn't do this thing that I created an expectation of, and so then I have failed. I love that you say that. It's not about identifying failures. It's about identifying what works for us and then what doesn't work. We're pulling on that old Edison quote, right? It's not about just defeating ourselves and saying that we didn't accomplish whatever this goal is that you set out for yourself. If you didn't create the light bulb, you didn't fail. You just found a new way not to create the light bulb.
If anything good came out of The Last Jedi, which I think generally was a not very good movie, is the quote from Yoda is that the greatest teacher failure is.
I love it. You know what? There's not a better way to end a teacher talk than a Yoda quote. I stand by that. I want to respect your time, and I genuinely actually need to go find my son because things are too quiet over here. But Nathan, I can't thank you enough. This will definitely not be the last time that we talk, but I hope that I can bring you to this platform again because this has been so rewarding. Thank you so much for your time. And for people that are watching, this is going to be archived on our YouTube playlist. And I want to do a shameless plug, something that Nathan has been involved with, as well as Joe Divig, who provided some comments today. So we have created what we're calling the Washington Orchestra Network, which is affiliated with our Washington Music Educators Association. And I'm working on some platforms to be able to share some resources and to celebrate the success that Washington music educators are having, particularly orchestra teachers and string teachers, that they're just trying some things and they're working for them. We're going to have a platform available. We've got a social media page through Facebook, and then I've created a Google Drive so that we'll be able to share some documents. So keep your eyes peeled for those of you that are in Washington State, and even those of you that are not necessarily on Washington, you can still like and follow that page. But this is for Washington educators that are trying some things out and have found some success. We're going to be sharing those resources for you, and we hope that you'd engage in that platform. Talk to us about what's working for you and share the success. Let us know what is working for you so that we can try it ourselves, so that we can reorient what it is that we're doing and how we envision our success with our students. So thank you for everybody that watched today, and those of you that might be looking at the archive video. Please stay plugged in, continue to have conversations and dialogue with your colleagues. Tune in next week for Teacher Talk. I'll be having another conversation with an educator and artist and talking about more success that we can experiment with and that we can find in these possibilities that exist in this unique time. I hope you have a great Sunday. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks so much.